Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study this morning. We're going to be in Ezekiel for a while now. Today we're going to be studying chapter 4 and 5. So let's get right to it. In review, we need to watch for three things, at least three things, but particularly three things, and particularly the third one. I want to read to you chapter 3, verses 24 through 27. Now listen to this. Then the Spirit came unto me, and raised me to my feet. He spoke to me and said, Go shut yourself inside your house, and you, son of man, they will tie with ropes. You will be bound so that you cannot go out among the people. I will make your tongue stick to the roof of your mouth, so that you will be silent and unable to rebuke them, for they are a rebellious people. In verse 27, But when I speak to you, I will open your mouth, and you shall say to them, This is what the sovereign Lord says. Whoever will listen, let him listen, and whoever will refuse, let him refuse, for they are a rebellious people. Okay, three things. Ezekiel confines himself to his house as commanded. They, whoever they are, they will bind him with ropes, and he will be silenced by God so that he cannot rebuke them. And for that matter, nor can he plead for the mercy of them, but he will be able to speak to them under God's command to speak his word. He's got to be silent in terms of everything except for when God wants him to say something to the people. I do not know who they are who will bind him or why, possibly because they will not like his message. We've talked about that before. The prophets have been maligned by the people because they just didn't believe what they were saying, and they didn't like what they were saying. So maybe they tied him up for that reason. Nevertheless, a friend of mine suggested that this is a close parallel to the coming confinement of Jerusalem. You know, that's what this book is about. It's about Jerusalem and their sin and their spiritual infidelity and idolatry towards God. And they're going to be eventually surrounded and captured by Babylon. So maybe this confinement in his house has something to do with that. Jerusalem is definitely all bound up by God. However, they are not permitted to speak to God for mercy or anything else. That means the people. The people cannot speak to God. I think I mentioned at the end of the last week's lesson that the elders came to Ezekiel, which are further over in the book. They come to him at some point in time and say, Ezekiel, we want to speak to God, and we're going to do it through you. And Ezekiel comes back and says, God says he doesn't want to speak to you. So they're not going to be able to talk to God, and Ezekiel is not going to be able to talk to them except for when God says to. Anyway, details in Scripture are there for a reason, and we should try to get everything out of it that we can. So if it seems like I'm just beating a dead horse on some of these scriptures, I don't want you to feel that way. We're talking about God's holy word. We're talking about a book that is seldom studied verse by verse. So we need to get everything out of it that we can. It's God's word and it's special. For the most part, I think it applies to Ezekiel and how he will relate to the exiles. One other point is that God prevented rebuke from Ezekiel because of their rebelliousness. That's what it said in verse 26. In chapter 5, 6, and 7, we'll see four prophetic dramatizations and one summary drama in chapter 7. We're not going to do all that today. We're just doing chapter 4 and 5. But we will see the increasing wrath from God. As we go through the book, it's going to get tougher and tougher on the people. Lots of sieges, famine, and violent deaths. We're going to see that some of that this week. One thing to be aware of and look for is that the cause of judgment in chapter 4 is generally referred to as sin. The reason for the judgment is their sin. But in chapter 5, 6, and 7 clearly specifies the sin as idolatry, violence, and rebellion against God and his laws. That's a good thing to remember, because we're going to see what we're really talking about there in terms of their relationship to other nations around them. All right, so let's get right into chapter 4. We're going to look at the first 8 verses as dramatization of the fall of Jerusalem. We're going to see some dramas. They're called sign acts that Ezekiel is going to act out. He's told what to do, and he's expected to act these things out to the specifications that God gives. So let's look at verses 1 through 3. Let me read that. 1 through 3 of chapter 4. Now, son of man, take a block of clay, put it in front of you, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it. Then lay siege to it. Erect siege works against it. Build a ramp up to it. Set up camps against it, and put battering rams around it. Then verse 3. Then take an iron pan, iron skillet, place it as an iron wall between you and the city, and turn your face toward it. It will be under siege, and you shall besiege it. This will be a sign to the people of Israel. Okay. Draw out a map of Jerusalem on this piece of clay. He is to erect a battle, and he is to enact a battle against it, against Jerusalem. This is about Jerusalem. Build siege ramps, camps around it, and battering rams around it. They will know he is focusing on Jerusalem. The protected city, remember? The people were living under 4 false assumptions. I'm not sure I can remember all of them, but one of them was that Jerusalem would never be destroyed. It's a protected city. And why was that? Because that's where the temple was. Nothing's going to happen to Jerusalem, they say in their minds. They've been told that. They believe it. And so they reject the law, the words of the prophets, because Jerusalem is the city of God. He put his name on it. His temple is there. He lives there. He will never allow Jerusalem to be conquered and people taken captive. That is what they're living under. The reality, though, the really tough part for them is the part about the iron skillet. Remember I told you he had to put an iron skillet between him and that piece of clay. This is a wall between Ezekiel and the city, and Ezekiel is to glare down on the city as would an attacking general. So you've got the city, which is the clay that he's drawn the city on. And here he is, and God said, put this iron skillet between you and the city. So we're going to see that Ezekiel is going to be playing the part of God. We're going to see that as we go on. The wall is the iron will of God's judgment. He will use the impenetrable barrier of Babylon's army, which will be used as God's chastening rod. He's going to use the nation of Babylon to chasten or to discipline Israel. Ezekiel sets his face against it, indicating God's firm resolve. So, city, skillet, Ezekiel. City drawn up on the clay is Jerusalem. Ezekiel will play the part of God. There's a separator between God and the people in the city of Jerusalem. It's symbolized by that iron skillet. And he said, turn your face toward it, glare down on that iron skillet. That's the separator. It is a sign of the coming destruction of Judah and Jerusalem. It is a further symbol of the Israelites being cut off from God. They are separated by God symbolically by that iron skillet. What they would not accept by the word from the prophets, they will witness through the symbolic action of Ezekiel. So you've got all those four false assumptions I just mentioned, alluded to a minute ago. They don't want to believe that, but they're going to see it acted out here in this sign act that God has given Ezekiel to dramatize. Okay, let's look at verses 4 through 8. Then, after you've done that sign act with the skillet and the clay and that sort of thing, then in verse 4, then lie on your left side and put the sin of the people of Israel upon yourself. You are to bear their sin for the number of days you lie on your side. You're going to lie on your side for a certain number of days. We're going to see what that is. Verse 5, I have assigned you the same number of days as the years of their sin. So for 390 days you will bear the sin of the people of Israel. So he's going to lie on his left side for 390 days. That's a long time. Okay, after verse 6, after you have finished this, after you've done this thing on your left side, lie down again, this time on your right side, and bear the sin of the people of Judah. The first was Israel on your left side. Israel, remember, is the northern kingdom. That's the 10 tribes that as of this time in history have already been conquered by Assyria. Now he says, lie on your right side and bear the sin of the people of Judah. That's the southern kingdom. That's the tribe that's made up of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, and that's where Jerusalem is and the temple. Lie on your right side and bear the sin of the people of Judah. I've assigned you 40 days a year for each year. Turn your face toward the siege of Jerusalem and with bared arm prophesy against her. Then verse 8, I will tie you up with ropes so that you cannot turn from one side to the other until you have finished the days of your siege. Wow. We have some serious detail here that nobody seems to understand. Lie on your left side, for the sin of Israel is on you. He is to lie there for 390 days, one day for each year. So that would be 390 days, symbolizing 390 years, to bear the sin of Israel. Then you switch over to your right side and bear the sin of Judah for 40 days, the same thing. The 40 days symbolizes 40 years each of their sin. I will tell you right now how aggravated I get with commentaries sometimes, because if they cannot figure out what those periods of times apply to, they say it's symbolic, a symbolic period of time. Well, that may be true. I'm not saying it's not true, but I'm saying that I believe this is literal. It's talking about a literal 390 years applying to the history of the northern kingdom, and a literal 40 days applying to the history of the southern kingdom. They want to make it symbolic, and it just doesn't seem symbolic when you're saying a specific time for a specific reason. What I'm saying is they've not been able to find a 390-year period of time that specifically would apply to the sin of the northern kingdom, and same for the 40 days of the southern kingdom. But then again, it could be symbolic. I do note that if you add those times together, 390 years plus 40 years, you get 430 years, and that's the exact number of time specified in Exodus 12, verses 40 and 41, that refers to the number of years the Israelites were in captivity in Egypt. So who knows? But nevertheless, I believe it's a specific time. I don't know that it matters for our study unless we knew exactly what it applied to. But nevertheless, that's what he is asked to do. They cannot find a literal time, place of 390 or 490 years of time prior to the destruction of Israel or Judah that would apply, that would seem to apply to this situation that Ezekiel is acting out. Personally, I see no reason to assume a non-literal interpretation, so I'm going to assume that it's literal. Another very important point to realize is that even though Ezekiel was to bear the sin of Israel, that when you say he's going to bear the sin of Israel and Judah, that has a lot of sound to it that sounds a lot like substitutionary assumption of sin, like he is being substituted for his sin. This has nothing to do with redemption. All right. Nothing Ezekiel is doing with his life has anything to do with his redeeming Israel and Judah. As Jesus was a substitutionary sacrifice for sinful mankind, that was a substitutionary event. This is not substitutionary in Ezekiel's case from the standpoint of redemption. The 390 and the 400 and the 40 years is to illustrate the accumulated burden of the history of their sin as the cause of their impending judgment. That 430-year period that we're talking about is to show that is the cause of their judgment. The reason for their judgment is that 430 years of sinful behavior, whatever it is. All right, that's what it applies to. The punishment for that sin is coming with full force, no matter what the false prophets have been talking about. Even though the false prophets had, for example, given those 4 false assumptions, been teaching them and preaching to them those 4 false assumptions, doesn't matter that they believe them with all their heart and that God's not going to actually do what he said he's going to do. They're going to be judged because of their failure in their relationship with God. It is important for Israel to realize that God's judgment does not end with the collapse of Judah and Jerusalem. This is very big, and I want you to understand this. It is binding and inescapable, and it will continue for decades under Babylon and centuries under other world powers, meaning when they are delivered from Babylon 70 years later, they're going to be delivered, but they're going to be delivered unto the Medes and the Persians who conquer Babylon. And then they're going to be delivered from the Medes and Persians to the Greeks, Alexander the Great and that crew that conquers the Medes and the Persians. Then they're going to continue to be delivered forward to the Romans when the Roman Empire is established and they defeat the Greeks. So even though that judgment seemed like, oh man, just 70 years, that's what Jeremiah prophesied, it's going to be 70 years. It goes on and on and on, and they're still living under it today, even though they are a nation now, and they do have recognizability and acknowledgement in the world as a nation. It happened in 1948. Okay, so let's look at verses 9 through 17. It's a prophetic dramatization of complete destruction and the unclean meal that they're instructed to eat, that Ezekiel is to prophesy to them. Let me read verses 9 through 11. Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt. Put them in a storage jar and use them to make bread for yourself. You are to eat it during the 390 days you lie on your side. So we're not done with that lying on your side for 390 days. Weigh out 20 shekels of food to eat each day and eat it at set times. In verse 11, also measure out a sixth of a hin of water and drink it at set times. All right. The grains are unusual, but not prohibitive for the Israelites. Grind them into a flour to cook bread with. Oh, by the way, it said that weigh out 20 shekels of food. That means 20 shekels worth of food. 20 shekels is a measurement of money. It's a monetary measurement. And so they're going to measure out that money's worth of those things that he's talking about there. It comes to about 8 ounces per day. The water would be less than a liter. So it'd be a half a Diet Coke bottle. Anyway, these measuring acts of food and water were performed at set times each day. Okay, that brings us to verses 12 through 15. So he's told to eat that during that 390-day period that he's lying on his, I think it was his left side. These are details, very important details. He could say 390 days. God, that's a long time. I'll just make it 375 days. It's going to make the same impact on them, and I won't be nearly as tired when I get through. God says 390 days, even though Ezekiel would say, well, I'm being obedient. I've gone out there and done 375 days on my left side. Or maybe I measure out a little bit more food because I might want to eat a little bit more. God says, do it this way. If you vary in any detail from the way he specified it, you are disobedient. And we're going to see that all of those details bear weight on the prophecy that he's going to be delivering. Sorry, let me look at verses 12 through 15. Eat the food as you would a loaf of barley bread. Bake it in the sight of the people, using human excrement for fuel. The Lord said, in this way the people of Israel will eat defiled food among the nations where I will drive them. Verse 14, then I said, not so, sovereign Lord. I have never defiled myself. From my mouth until now, I have never eaten anything. You got to remember, he is a priest. From my mouth until now, I have never eaten anything found dead or torn by wild animals. No impure meat has ever entered my mouth. In verse 15, very well, he said, very well, God said, basically, I will let you bake your bread over cow manure, cow dung, instead of human excrement. Wow. Not very appetizing. He is to bake his bread, verse 12, he is to bake his bread over human excrement. If you look at the King James, you can see that's exactly what it says it is. It sounds like manure or dung, and that's exactly what the King James says it is, dung. So in case you were wondering, well, maybe it says human excrement, it doesn't really mean that, but that's exactly what it means. The fact that it is from humans makes it defiled, not because it is excrement. That's what we have to understand. He says cook it over human excrement. The fact that's what makes it defiled food is because he was told to use human excrement. If they had used cow manure or excrement from some clean animal, considered clean animal, it would not be defiled. Okay. Verse 13 and 14, God says the people will be forced to eat defiled food to indicate, now listen, here's the reason for it. God says the people will be forced to eat defiled food to indicate to them austere conditions in the nations he will be driving them to. So life's not going to be all that great where they're going. When Babylon captures them, they're going to be well cared for, but they're not going to be eating like they used to eat. Ezekiel complains that he has never eaten defiled food, so God relents for his part and allows him to use cow manure instead of baking process in preparation of his own food. God's concession indicates his kindness regarding the emotional needs of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is a priest. He is a good priest. And he points out that he's never eaten defiled food, unclean food. And God cuts him a break, says that's fine. Use cow manure instead. Using animal excrement is not defiling, and it is not even unusual. As trees are scarce, they just don't go down to the 7-Eleven and buy a bag of charcoal when they want to cook. Or they don't get a can of fire starter, to start their blazes. They don't have as many trees around as what they'd have to support all those people. So they have to use everything that they can, and they would mix animal manure with straw, which is not a defiling process. It's important to realize this. He said use human. That's the fact that it was human is what was defiling. Sounds very gross to us, 21st well-heeled Christians, but this sign act is intended to indicate very bad times are coming. They'll very clearly understand what he's talking about. Meager rations will be the order of the day, and it will be under conditions much, much worse than we can possibly imagine right now. All right, let's look at verses 16 to 17, chapter 4. He then said to me, Son of man, I'm about to cut off the food supply in Jerusalem. The people will eat rationed food in anxiety and drink rationed water in despair, for food and water will be scarce. They will be appalled at the sight of each other and will waste away because of their sin. Man, they're going to be appalled at the sight of each other. It's clear enough. Interruption of the food supply will cause the people to waste away or starve. They'll be under starvation type conditions. Women will eventually cook their own babies. We'll look ahead to chapter 5, verse 10. We're going to see cannibalism is going to come to cannibalism before it's completely over. Starvation and disease will be occurring everywhere. I've alluded to or mentioned before about Lamentations, talking about the terrible conditions in Jerusalem after Babylon is conquered them and when they're going through all that. I want to look at a few of those verses, like Lamentations 1:19. Take just a few minutes to read these things, if I can find it. All right, Lamentations 1:19, talking about bad times in Jerusalem. Lamentations 1:19. I called to my allies, but they betrayed me. My priests and my elders perished in the city while they searched for food to keep themselves alive. My priests and my elders were looking for food for themselves. The religious leaders, the people that are supposed to be looking after them, are going to be looking after themselves first. All right? Flip over to chapter 2, I'll just read it to you. Chapter 2, verses 11 and 12 in Lamentations. My eyes fail from weeping, Jeremiah the weeping prophet. My eyes fail from weeping. I am in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground because my people are destroyed, because children and infants faint in the streets of the city. In verse 12, they say to their mothers, where is bread and wine? As they faint like the wounded in the streets of the city, as their lives ebb away in their mother's arms. It's terrible. Chapter 4. Lamentations chapter 4. Verse 4. Because of thirst, the infant's tongue sticks to the roof of its mouth. The children beg for bread, but no one gives it to them. Verse 9. Those killed by the sword are better off than those who die of famine. Racked with hunger, they will waste away for lack of food from the field. In verse 13, but it happened because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who shed within her the blood of the righteous. Okay, we don't need to go on. It's just I just wanted to know what is coming for them as a result of their sin. It even mentions it again there in Lamentations. This is coming because of their sin. And it's very specific sin. It's not using a cuss word every now and then, or spitting on the sidewalk, or going to the movie on Sunday. It is their lack of valid relationship with God. It's sinful sexual immorality, religious immorality towards God. It's putting him in a place of irrelevance. It's all of those things. That's why this is coming to pass. God finally got enough, and this is what he's going to do about it. Okay, that brings us to chapter 5. There's two parts to the drama in chapter 5. Verses 1 through 4, Ezekiel is told to shave his head, take his sword and shave his head, and he gives the instructions as how to dispose of the hair. And then verses 5 through 17, this interpretation is verse 5 through 17 is the interpretation of the drama. All right, let me read chapter 5, verses 1 through 4 of Ezekiel. Now, son of man, take a sharp sword and use it as a barber's razor to shave your head and your beard. Then take a set of scales and divide up the hair. When the days of your siege come to an end, burn a third of the hair inside the city. Take a third and strike it with the sword around the city, and scatter a third of it to the wind, for I will pursue them with drawn sword. In verse 3, but take a few hairs and tuck them away in the folds of your garment. Again, take a few of these and throw them into the fire and burn them up. A fire will spread from there to all of Israel. All right, take a sword, use it as a razor, shave your head and your beard. As he does this, the razor cuts away hair. Invading armies cut away the population from the land. They're going to surgically remove them. Babylon is, just like a sword cuts off hair. It's going to separate them. At the end of your siege, as illustrated by the cutting away of the hair, burn a third of it around the city, the third of your hair around the city, to show destruction of the city. Take a third of it and beat it and burn it, beat it around the city to show those who will die by the sword. Beat it with your sword to illustrate those who will die by the sword, and scatter the remaining 1/3 of it to the wind to show the dispersal to the nations. That is what's coming. It hasn't happened yet, but that's what this sign act is to illustrate, and they will know what he's talking about. This is a vision for Ezekiel and a demonstration for the people. Ezekiel is told to do this, and he's to do it for the people. He says, scatter a third to the wind because I will pursue them, because God will pursue them with drawn sword. He's going to pursue them with Babylon as his chastening rod. He's going to use them to do all of this. Take a few strands of hair, tuck it away in your garment and in the fold of your garment, and then burn a few. When he says tuck a few in the fold of your garment, that means save it back. You're going to burn a third, a third, and a third. You're going to destroy all of that, but you're going to save a little back. We're going to talk about that. The fire, the judgment, will spread to the whole house of Israel. A demonstration of symbolic acts will carry much more significance, I suppose, than the spoken word. So, in other words, they see it, they'll remember it. If he says it, they may or may not remember it. Maybe I should act out my lessons. If you're not going to remember what I say, maybe you remember it if you saw me do something. The weighing of the hair symbolizes the evaluation and pending judgment. He said, weigh out the hair, take a third of it by weight, and blah, 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 so on and so forth. That evaluates the evaluation and pending judgment. Putting the hair in the folds of his garment represents the remnant. Remember, I told you that Isaiah was the one that developed the doctrine of the remnant. He didn't do it on his own. I mean, God told him all of this, but he was the one that got the revelation from God that there will always be some Jews saved. There was a remnant in the flood. I want you to think about that. There was a remnant in the flood. God comes to destroy the whole world except for a remnant. There was a remnant to repopulate with. That remnant was Noah and his family. Here, as with every incident in the life of Israel from now until all the way through the tribulation, the Great Tribulation, there's going to be a remnant. They will never all be killed. And that's what those few hairs demonstrate. There's going to be a remnant, but here it's the remnant has to do with this Babylonian exile. A few will be preserved. Remember, the people of Judah thought the remnant was going to be the ones that remained in Jerusalem. In reality, the remnant was the ones that were taken to Babylon. You can read Lamentations and get a very clear idea of what I'm talking about. Okay, verses 5 and 6, chapter 5. This is what the sovereign Lord says. This is Jerusalem, which I have set in the center of the nations with countries all around her. Yet in her wickedness she has rebelled against my laws and decrees more than the nations and countries around her. She has rejected my laws and has not followed my decrees. They are worse than the nations, the ungodly, the godless nations, I say godless, the ones that don't worship Yahweh, who surround her. These are tough verses. We know, but they do not know yet that Jerusalem will be destroyed. So that they will, not so that, but in opposition to one of their false beliefs was that Jerusalem will never be destroyed. Remember, we labored under that. They labored under that. There's 4 of them. Jerusalem is the city of God. He put his name on it. He put his temple there. That's where he lives, and so on and so forth. They are safe in living there. God would never let that happen to his hometown. They're going to find out that's not true. They are still holding out hope that Jerusalem will be saved, and this sign act is referring to the fall of Babylon, not to Jerusalem, but to Babylon. Remember, one of the things I told you that was that one of their false beliefs was that the day of the Lord would be victory for God, and it would also be victory for Judah. Well, that's going to prove to be wrong as well. The day of the Lord means Babylon is the one that is going to be the victor, and they are going to be the ones that are led into captivity. To avoid any doubt, What does God say? Look at verse 5 and let me read it again. Verse 5 of chapter 5. This is what the sovereign Lord says. This is Jerusalem, which I have set in the center of the nations with countries all around her. Jerusalem, all the countries all around her, all the Middle Eastern countries you know of, Syria, Iran, and all that bunch, Saudi Arabia. Down here is Africa, over here is Egypt, over here is Russia. They're completely surrounded with all these non-Jewish nations. Okay? And yet in her wickedness, she has rebelled against my laws and decrees more than the nations and countries around her. She has rejected my laws and not followed my decrees. This is Jerusalem. God goes on to say that he has set Jerusalem to be in the center of the world, surrounded by nations, meaning what? Surrounded by Gentiles. Jews, Gentiles. The center of the nations. Many people want to take statements like this and reduce them to irrelevance. But every word in the Bible is important. What I've just told you, the Bible says there is important. We don't want to make light of it. We don't want to ignore it. It's there. It's there important for a reason. It's there for because it's important. Here, Israel and Jerusalem were the center of religion and the center of world affairs. It lay in the center of various world empires. It was a trade and travel center. It was a religious center. It was a place where God chose to put his name. It was a place where Christ will rule from at some point in the future. Yet, that's a big word. The Israelites dwelt on the privilege of being God's chosen people. We are chosen by God. We're the Bampus of the campus. No worries here. He's going to do something to conquer Babylon, and we're going to have our lives go on as usual. They became arrogant. They developed a nationalistic spirit at a time when they should have been God's instrument in redemption, for evangelism for God. They were an example of rebellion against his laws and his ordinances, even more than the Gentile nations. Now, the point of that is they had the laws, God's laws, and they basically rejected them. So when he says they rejected them more than the Gentile nations didn't have it, so they didn't reject it. They didn't reject something they didn't have. God gives everything to Israel, and they rejected it. That's what he's talking about. All right, verses 7 through 12. We're getting pretty ugly here. It's used 4 times the word therefore to introduce what God will say. All right, let's look at verse 7. Chapter 5, verse 7 of Ezekiel. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. You have been more unruly than the nations around you and have not followed my decrees or kept my laws. You have not even conformed to the standards of the nations around you. Not only have you rejected my stuff, you don't use their stuff either. It's pretty clear. You didn't do what I asked you to do. You didn't even do as well as the Gentile nations around you. This means the Hebrews knew better. They have God. They have their religious system prescribed by God. They had his word. They knew better. This makes the judgment even more reprehensible, even more deserving. Verse 8 and 9. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself am against you, Jerusalem, and I will inflict punishment on you in the sight of the nations. Because of all your detestable idols, I will do to you what I have never done before and will never do again. Wow. God himself is against them. Since they refuse to be examples of righteousness and godliness as his chosen people, they would be examples of discipline. I want to mention that. We're talking about punishment here and judgment, but it's judgment for the rejection of his laws and ordinances and their lack of relationship with him. But it's done as a punishment for that, but it's also done with God's heart pointing towards discipline for purposes of drawing them back to him. Because we're going to see many times in the rest of the book of Ezekiel that there are promises for the future. He wants them to come back. He wants them to be able to share and participate in those promises. And the only way they're going to be able to do that is for them to come back to him. So that's what the idea of discipline is. Because of their abominations and idolatry, he makes a pledge on this severity of the judgment. The pledge has never been done before, and it will never be done again. That's the significance of what's getting ready to happen in the book of Ezekiel, in the Babylonian exile. All right, verse 10, chapter 5, verse 10. Therefore, in your midst, parents will eat their children, and children will eat their parents. I will inflict punishment on you and will scatter all of your survivors to the winds. Now, probably if you're not doing verse-by-verse study of Ezekiel, you're not going to cover that verse. It's pretty clear what it's talking about. It's talking about cannibalism. And the reason it's not just for fun because we like the taste of what grandma or one of my babies is. It's because there's nothing else to eat. That's the severity of this famine that's going to be going around because of the what Babylon is doing to them in the war. It's further clarification of the severity of the judgment. It's cannibalism. One military tactic was to surround a city and cut off the food supply, leading to starvation or surrender. You can avoid all this starvation if you surrender. When you are starving, you will eat anything, and God says that means you will eat each other. I can't help but cover this. We're talking about a severe situation that God is inflicting on these people because of their sin. And I just have to make it clear to you what the Bible says is going on here. And that's one of the things not pleasant to talk about, not pleasant to think about, but nevertheless it's there, and it's there for our understanding and edification. I will inflict punishment on you. Survivors will be scattered. I feel certain that we need to take a minute to look at, we're not going to look at it, but let me just tell you that the Leviticus 26 verses 14 to 46 is something similar to, you've heard of the blessings and the curses that are back in Deuteronomy. Those verses in chapter 26 of Leviticus are similar. You've got the first few verses, I guess it would be the first 13 verses of chapter 26 are the good things, the sweet things. The 14 through 46 is the ugly things. If you're disobedient, and God says what disobedience means. If you're disobedient, this is what's going to happen to you. And it's a severe thing. It's not like they have not been warned. They had Deuteronomy, they had Leviticus, and they need to know that God is serious about his word. And they have reduced God to a position of irrelevance, meaning they don't believe what he says. And he's got this here so they'll know, I warned you, I warned you, I warned you. All right, verses 11 and 12. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because you have defiled my sanctuary with all of your vile images and detestable practices, I myself will shave you. I will not look on you with pity or spare you. A third of your people will die of the plague or perish by famine inside you. A third will fail by the sword outside of your walls, and a third will be scattered to the winds and pursued with drawn sword. You think God is not jealous for his people? He wants his people, and he doesn't have his people. His people have rejected him. You think he has infinite patience that he'll put up with stuff forever? No. We have our own warnings as a people. You know, it's all going to come to a head for humanity at the second coming of Christ, when the world lives through the Great Tribulation. You think he speaks with no seriousness? You think because you are his chosen people, and we are as well, that he will not act? He is so serious about idolatry and disobedience, he swears on his own life that he will judge Israel. Well, I read this book, now I should be reading 11 through 12, but just notice verse 11, he said, therefore, as surely as I live, he is swearing on his life. No, not only was Israel guilty of idolatry and the detestable practices that go with it, they took it into the temple, God's dwelling place. When we get to chapter 8, you're going to see one of the things that just broke my heart as I studied Ezekiel in my own personal Bible study time. You're going to see things going on in the temple that you're saying, what? This is his chosen people that we're talking about. And then when you get to chapter 8, if you hadn't picked up on it by then, you're going to see in chapter 8 what's upsetting God so bad. It shows more disregard and disrespect for God than anything else. It reduces him to irrelevance. It reduces him to a God that is not true to his word and one who will not act in judgment. He's a God of love. He's not going to do that to us. He could never do something like that. They're going to find out God is well-rounded. He's got two sides. He's a God of love, but he's also got a just and righteous side to him, and he has to be true to both sides. He will act in judgment. He goes on, their unparalleled sin will get them unprecedented judgment. 1/3 are going to die by plague and famine. 1/3 die by the sword outside the walls of the city while they're fighting. Jeremiah told them, don't fight. Give up. You'll be taken to Babylon, but you're going to be cared for. It will go well with you in Babylon. If you stay, you're going to die by the sword. Here it is. 1/3 will die by the sword outside the walls fighting. 1/3 will be scattered at the destruction of the nations and pursued by the sword. One commentator puts it this way: the greatness of God's love for his people demands a firm and severe response whenever that love is ignored or violated. So why do you think Ezekiel is never studied in detail? Until I taught this, I studied it on my own. I think I told you, I said I can never teach this book. And then a month later, I found out that you don't get to dictate to God what you're going to do. I found myself teaching this to my class. And now here I am teaching it again. But I don't know, in all of my 50 years of teaching, I don't know that I've ever been taught or ever taught the full book of Ezekiel. There's many verses in here that are cherry-picked and used for sermons, used for examples, used to illustrate promises of God. But I've never looked at it verse by verse. So I was really shocked when I started that study. Why do you think that is? Is it too much angry God in there? Is there too much death? Is there too much punishment? Is it part of God's character? It is part of God's character. It requires our attention. Okay. Verse 13. Then, chapter 5, verse 13. Then my anger will cease, and my wrath against them will subside, and I will be avenged. And when I have spent my wrath on them, they will know that I, the Lord, have spoken in my zeal. Finally, some relief. God's motive was redemptive and related to salvation. His anger does not last forever. I must remind you, it was a righteous anger. It wasn't just getting mad for the sake of getting mad. He has reason for anger, and it's a righteous anger because he's a righteous judge. His wrath against them will subside because he will have been avenged. When these things happen, they will know he has acted in his zeal out of his true character for his people. Then to close out the chapter, verses 14 through 17, now he gets back to judgment. Had this not have already happened in history, many would say that this is just figurative language and it would never really happen. I should remind you that what I have already told you. For the average person, the bad news of the Bible will be worse than what the words indicate. For the good news, it will be better. So when we're reading the bad part of this thing, the horrible part, the cannibalism, the stuff that goes all around that, the judgment that goes on in every way, it's going to be worse than what you're picturing in your mind. Or it was worse. It's already happened for us, for our time. For bad things which happen in our daily lives, many would say, I could never love a God that would allow or care or cause such things. Well, that person may want to reconsider their position. The things I am about to read are bad for the person under judgment, but God was clearly in charge when they happened. You may say that was a different time. To that I say, yes, it was a different time, but it was the same God who never changes. All right, now let me read verses 14 to 17. These are the last verses of the chapter. I will make you a ruin and reproach among the nations around you in the sight of all who pass by. You will be a reproach and a taunt, a warning and an object of horror to the nations around you when I inflict punishment on you in anger and in wrath and with stinging rebuke. I, the Lord, have spoken. When I shoot at you with my deadly and destructive arrows of famine, I will shoot to destroy you. I will bring more and more famine upon you and cut off your supply of food. I will send famine and wild beasts against you, and they will leave you childless. Plague and bloodshed will sweep through you, and I will bring the sword against you. I, the Lord, have spoken. He's already told them this was going to happen back in the days of Moses, in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus. If they are disobedient, and he defines what disobedience means, if they do that, this is what they can expect. They are disobedient to the very letter of what he has specified in their way they relate to him and disregard for him, and he's got reduced to irrelevance. They disregarded his laws and his ordinances. And he said, you do that, this is what you can expect. All right. 72 times in Ezekiel, God says, I, the Lord. It's often joined with, you should know. God wants us to know that his actions were done so that his motives and his true character can be known. He wants us to know. Thank God we have the Word of God. He wants us to know that what he says, he means. When he says, I love you, it means I love you. When it says, don't do this, or this will happen, you can expect, if you do that, this will happen. It is in the Word of God. It's in this book. And this is not just a book. This is the written Word of God. God wants us to know that actions were done so that his motives and his character can be known. Such knowledge always was associated with the judgment, with his judgment or his mercy. The nations, rather than seeing Israel as God's love, holiness, and righteousness, and desire to save his nations, all would see them as ruin, taunt, or reproach, warning, and object of horror. You remember Psalm 137? We studied that as a result of as part of our study of Hosea. I just nearly through here, but I want to read on this business of being a taunt. I want to read Psalm 137 verses 1 through 3. This is what it's like to be in captivity. And it was specifically these people in captivity, talking about, you're never really treated with respect. And I've never been a captive. So I'm only speaking from what I've read and what I understand. But captives are hated by the people that have taken them captive. And they show them no respect. They tear down their gods. Here's what they did regarding this word taunt that I just mentioned. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps. For there our captives asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. We're captive. Zion is a thing of the past. We're in captivity. And he says, sing us a song that makes you happy. It's a taunt. There's nothing that makes them happy. They're in captivity. Sing us something that makes us happy. Sing us songs of Jerusalem. That's what they have to look forward to. That kind of treatment for 70 years. They're not going to starve. They're going to have houses to live in and that sort of thing. But it's going to be a very unhappy time for them. I think that to study the judgment of Israel, how terrible it actually was and how long they had to endure it, is a good study to know, to show the final eternal punishment for the unredeemed man, what the eternal punishment for the redeemed man will be. It will be unrelenting. It will be agonizing, and it will not end at a finite period of time as did that for Israel. It will be eternal. God's judgment has purpose. It's well defined. We know when it comes, and we know what it's going to be. So if he was judging Israel in such a way that had a finite period of time to it, and it's actually still going on today, but nevertheless, it will end. There is an eternal punishment that God will be meting out to people that do not have faith in Jesus Christ, and it will be eternal, and it will be very unpleasant. All right, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for studying with me.